Chapter 7. Why the Green Revolution Isn't Here Yet. Way back in 1976, a leading environmental campaigner who remains a loud voice on climate today confidently declared that an economy based wholly on solar energy was now economic or nearly economic. He was wrong then, and 4 decades later, he is still wrong. Governments around the world spend more than $140 billion every year subsidizing inefficient solar energy and wind power. Yet despite this huge expenditure, together these renewable sources provide only about 1% of global energy needs. So why hasn't the green energy revolution happened yet? Because without breakthrough innovations, it remains enormously expensive. Carbon dioxide emissions are a byproduct of the cheap and dependable energy delivered by fossil fuels that has underpinned 200 years of development. Ending our reliance on fossil fuels within decades will cost hundreds of trillions of dollars. Most rich countries attempting to meet that price tag would face electoral upheaval. Instead, they settle for spending hundreds of billions of dollars subsidizing highly visible solar and wind without achieving much. The world's poor nations don't have trillions to spend. For them, the prospect of getting more energy from fossil fuels is much more enticing. And thus, everyone on the planet talks about renewable energy, but little of any substance is happening. We are constantly being told that renewables like solar and wind are just about to take over the world. This is almost entirely wishful thinking. One of the foremost climate campaigners, Jim Hansen, puts it best. Suggesting that renewables will let us phase rapidly off fossil fuels in the United States, China, India, or the world as a whole is almost the equivalent of believing in the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy. Bear in mind that Dr. Hansen is the climate scientist who initiated public concern on global warming when he testified to Congress back in 1988, and he was former Vice President Al Gore's climate advisor. When most people talk about renewables, they typically think of solar and wind energy. These are the new renewables. But globally, 85% of all renewable energy comes from wood and hydropower, what we can call old renewables. These old sources have the benefit of providing power when we need it. In contrast, solar and wind power can't be turned on when needed. Despite the incessant hype, it remains an inconvenient truth that they produce power only when the sun decides to shine or the wind decides to blow. That is why solar and wind power work only as a small addition to the baseload power that comes from fossil fuels and other reliable energy sources. If we want to increase the use of solar and wind significantly, we need to add backup power, such as idle fossil fuel-powered gas turbines that can be turned on when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, or batteries that can store energy. Both add significantly to the cost of solar and wind energy. The sheer scale of battery storage capacity that would be needed for solar power to work is vastly underappreciated. Today, the United States has enough batteries across the entire nation to store just 14 seconds of average U.S. electricity use. These fundamental economic and technological challenges are why no big nation in the world is anywhere close to seeing new renewable energy do more than nibble at the edges of energy consumption. This is clear when you look at the share of renewable electricity from all sources in the U.S. Wind power produced less than 7% of the U.S. electricity in 2018, and solar power less than 2%. In total, renewable energy sources produced 17% of the United States' electricity, but most of this came from old renewables, with the majority coming from reliable hydroelectricity. Percentage of U.S. energy consumption, not just electricity, that comes from renewables, 1900 to 2050. The almost vertical line showing 100% renewables by 2030 represents common claims to achieve rapid conversion to all renewables. And electricity is itself only a part of all the energy used in the United States, which also includes the energy utilized in industrial production, in heating buildings, and in driving cars, trucks, and buses. When measured against all energy use, wind power in the United States produced 2.5% of U.S. energy in 2018, and solar power only about 0.5%. Almost 3/4 of renewable energy still came from old wood and hydropower. As we can see in figure 7.1, over the past century, the share of renewable energy in the United States declined from almost 1/4 of all energy use to little more than 5%. Since 2000, mostly because of concern about climate change, renewable energy use has picked up from high single digits to about 11% today, and is expected to reach almost 16% of all U.S. energy by mid-century, according to the government's latest official estimate, almost unchanged from the last Obama administration estimate in 2017 of 16.5%. We need to be honest. Reaching 16% of total U.S. energy in 2015 does not mean that renewable energy is taking over from fossil fuels. That percentage is actually less than what U.S. renewable energy sources contributed in 1900. And even by 2050, solar and wind power are projected to make up less than half of the 16% of renewables, 4 and 3 percentage points respectively, with most of this still coming from the reliable old sources of wood and hydropower. When we hear politicians vowing to deliver 100% renewable energy by 2030 or 2050, look at figure 7.1. We could call it the narwhal chart. It shows that such ideas are unmoored by historical reality or common sense. The U.S. experience reflects global trends. Today, solar panels and wind turbines together deliver only 1.1% of global energy. The International Energy Agency estimates that even by 2040, solar and wind power will cover less than 5% of global energy needs. The jarring fact is that humanity just finished spending 2 centuries getting rid of renewable energy and replacing it with fossil fuels. See figure 7.2. Renewable energy as a percentage of total global energy, 1800 to 2050. Data from 1800 to 2018. The hatched funnel shows the spread of scenarios from the International Energy Agency and United Nations. When everyone was poor, the whole world cooked and kept warm using polluting renewable energy sources like wood and dung. Over a century and a half, we shed our reliance on renewable energy and powered the Industrial Revolution with fossil fuels. For the last 50 years, the levels of renewables globally has hardly budged from a level of around 13 to 14%. This reality mostly reflects the continued reliance of the world's worst off on wood and dung. Indeed, when we look at pathways ahead to 2040 or 2050, we see that it is very unlikely that the world will reach a point where more than 20% of its energy needs are met by renewable sources. It is likely that our share of renewable energy in 2050 will still be lower than what it was in 1950. It utterly beggars belief to suggest that we'll manage to get to 100% by 2030 or 2050. In the poor world, replacing fossil fuels with new renewable energy sources like wind and solar power is hard because most people desperately want much more power at lower cost, not fickle power at high cost. Half a century ago, the average Chinese had less electricity available than the poorest African today. Since then, with rapid industrialization and a rocketing use of coal power, China has catapulted itself away from poverty and increased its GDP per person 72 times, but at the cost of becoming the world's biggest carbon dioxide emitter. Most poor countries want to follow China's path. As Gwede Mantashe, South Africa's energy minister, puts it, energy is the catalyst for growth. Indeed, the International Energy Agency estimates that by using more coal, oil, and gas, and less renewable sources, along with much better governance, Africa can usher in an African century that will increase carbon dioxide emissions, but also grow the economy much faster, such that by 2040, every African will make $1,000 more every year. But why can't we solve the poor world's energy poverty problems with solar panels and wind turbines? This is, in fact, what many development organizations and green energy companies claim to be doing. Their claims do not add up. To see how the benefits of green energy sources like solar and wind power are being massively oversold, we should look to the poor Indian village of Darnai, which became India's first solar-powered community. The citizens had for years unsuccessfully tried to get connected to the national electric power grid, which mostly is supplied by coal-fired power plants. Along came a green benefactor. In 2014, under the slogan Energy Access Simplified, Greenpeace supplied Darnai with a solar-powered microgrid, an electric grid that's not connected to the central grid. Greenpeace proudly declared that Darnai refused to give in to the trap of the fossil fuel industry. The world's media reported excitedly on the first village in India where all aspects of life are powered by solar. Greenpeace had the best of intentions, but intentions don't count for much in development. The day the electricity was turned on, the batteries were drained of power within a few hours. A boy from Darnai remembers wanting to do his homework early in the morning before leaving to work in the fields, but there wasn't enough power for the family's one lamp. Because solar power is way too weak to power a stove, the citizens now had maybe a lamp illuminating the kitchen, but they still had to use the same old cook stoves, burning wood or dung, polluting the home, and putting the whole family at risk. Greenpeace invited the state chief minister to the inauguration of the solar power system so he could meet grateful inhabitants. When he showed up, he was met by a large crowd of people waving signs demanding real electricity, the kind you can use to run a refrigerator or a stove, and that your children can use to do their homework in the morning, and not fake electricity, meaning solar energy that could do none of these things. A week after the protests, Darnai was hooked up to the national grid with more reliable electricity access. Its residents now get power from the grid at 1/3 of the price. This situation repeats itself around the world. In Fiji, the government teamed up with a Japanese technology company to deliver off-grid solar power to remote communities. They provided a centralized solar power unit to the village of Rukua. Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama proudly declared that he had no doubt that a number of development opportunities will be unlocked by the provision of a reliable source of energy. Understandably, all of Rukua was thrilled to get access to energy and wanted to take full advantage. So more than 30 households purchased refrigerators. Unfortunately, the off-grid solar energy system was incapable of powering more than 3 fridges at a time, so every night the power would be completely drained. That led to 6 households buying diesel generators. According to researchers who studied this project, Rukua is now using about 3 times the amount of fossil fuel for electricity that was used prior to installation of the renewable energy system. In rather understated language, the researchers concluded that the project did not meet the resilience building needs of the community. Solar panels do deliver some benefits, allowing you to charge your cell phone and run a light at night, but they don't deliver benefits that help drive development. One common anecdote holds that solar light allows students to study at night and hence improve learning. Published in 2017, the first controlled study from India shows that solar power actually has no impact on time spent studying or schooling. It also shows that solar power doesn't increase time spent working or improving savings, spendings, business creation, or broader development. As a result, solar panels are not what people most want. In Tanzania, a survey of households with solar panels showed that almost 90% still wanted access to the electric grid. Moreover, when asked in polls across the continent, Africans report that solar panels provide much less benefit than they cost. On average, the private benefit is worth only 30 to 41% of the total costs. Even when including the extra health benefits like a reduction in damaging indoor air pollution from kerosene lamps, it is likely that the solar panels are worth less to the average African than what the well-meaning rich people pay to put them up. In climate-excited rich countries, governments have attempted to force more renewable energy into the system through regulation and subsidies. In Germany and the European Union as a whole, we see the results of this approach. Germany's renewable energy policy, called the Energiewende, has been hailed by environmentalists and politicians around the world. Under this decades-old policy, the nation has moved away from nuclear and fossil fuels toward wind, solar, and biomass energy. The Energiewende has cost $36 billion annually in recent years and is the country's biggest political project since reunification. Electricity costs have doubled over the past 2 decades and are now at 35 cents per kilowatt hour, almost 3 times the US average. Germans will have spent $580 billion on renewables and related infrastructure by 2025. This massive expenditure has meant renewable energy sources have gone from meeting 7% of Germany's total electricity needs in 2000 to 35% of electricity needs in 2019, with solar and wind power accounting for 2/3 of the renewable electricity. But the country has been worried about nuclear power, especially since a 2011 accident in Fukushima, Japan, triggered by an earthquake and tsunami. This fear has led to a halving of nuclear energy from 2000 to 2019. Since nuclear power is carbon-free, the decline in nuclear energy has offset much of the increase in solar and wind power. Overall, fossil fuels have declined only slightly as a share of German energy. In the first decade of the new millennium, the fossil fuel share of the overall energy supply dropped somewhat from 84 to 80%. But in the years since the Energiewende was passed in 2010, the fossil fuel share has stayed almost constant, inching down just 1 percentage point to 79% today. In the larger European Union, renewable energy sources have since the turn of the century increased from 6 to 14% in 2018. But there's a catch. Most of this renewable energy does not come from solar and wind. In total, solar and wind make up 2.7% of all energy, whereas biomass makes up more than 10%. Biomass, which basically is a fancy-sounding name for wood, is one of the old, reliable renewables that can produce energy when it is needed. The problem for the planet is that wood is often imported from US forests in diesel-driven ships and emits more carbon dioxide than even coal when it is burned. Biomass is categorized by the EU only as carbon dioxide free because it is hoped that felled trees will be replanted and over many future decades will soak up as much carbon dioxide as was released by its burning. Needless to say, this is dubious accounting at best. With this trickery and reliance on wood imported from the United States, the EU has managed to cut fossil fuel use from 79% in 2000 to 71% in 2018. Yet, the cost of this energy policy is now more than 2% of the EU's economy, or about $400 billion every year. Indeed, about 20% of the EU budget is now being spent on climate policies. Today, residential electricity costs in the EU are twice the US costs of 13 cents per kilowatt hour. This gap will grow quickly. Over the next decade, one 2019 study estimates that, mostly because of stronger climate policies, the wholesale electricity price in the EU will quadruple. It is impossible to get around the fact that climate policies are expensive. What do campaigners and politicians do? They either downplay the cost or, far more dangerously, maneuver to make it appear that there will actually be a net benefit. If we change from dirty fossil fuels to clean renewable sources, they claim, we will not only solve the climate crisis, but unlock jobs, savings, competitiveness, and improved well-being. American political commentator Thomas Friedman frequently talks about how the United States needs to jump on the clean energy bandwagon or face the prospect that China will clean our clocks when they take home all the benefits. This attempt to rewrite the facts is perhaps nowhere clearer than when, in 2018, the UN Secretary General touted a report that he said showed the world could gain at least $26 trillion in benefits from strong climate action as soon as 2030. What are we waiting for? Weirdly enough, the report claimed $26 trillion in benefits without explaining how that number was reached. The actual documentation, the report told us, was in a working paper that would be published shortly. I contacted the authors and asked to see how they reached this fantastical figure. For a year and a half, I have been in touch every few weeks with people connected with the publication. At the time of writing this book, the document has yet to be made available. Claiming that climate policy is not only good for climate, but also will actually make everyone rich is a comforting bedtime story. But it is flat out wrong. Every serious report shows extraordinarily large costs from climate policy, simply because changing the energy infrastructure that has underpinned the last 2 centuries of economic growth will be very, very costly. The UN estimates that the additional infrastructure cost alone of achieving the 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.5 degrees Celsius limit would come to almost $1 trillion each and every year for the next 30 years. A 2018 Goldman Sachs report shows that the cost to build just the infrastructure for electric cars, such as charging stations and power networks, would be an astronomical $6 trillion, or 8% of today's global GDP. As such costs rack up, political opposition will become ever more likely, causing backtracks on climate policy, as we have seen in France and elsewhere, and even cancellation, as President Trump has done with U.S. involvement in the Paris Agreement. If the European Union sticks to its climate promises for 2050, it alone could end up paying more than $2.5 trillion per year in climate costs, 10% of its entire GDP. This is more than all the EU's current spending on education, health, environment, housing, defense, police, and courts. It is inconceivable that such spending will go unchallenged. New renewable energy sources like solar and wind cost $141 billion annually in subsidies globally and matter little in the global energy supply. Rich countries can spend trillions and still achieve very little. Poor countries don't have trillions to spend and instead want more energy, which will come predominantly from fossil fuels. This, in a nutshell, is why global climate policies are failing. There has been far more global attention to climate change in recent years, with protest movements and campaigners ensuring the issue remains on the front page of newspapers. But the world's decision makers are even more off track than ever. This is why the UN itself summarized the 2010s as a lost decade and found there was essentially no difference between contemporary reality and an imaginary scenario in which there had been no new climate policies since 2005. This was a decade full of global talks, of promises made by politicians, and of climate laws enacted. Yet on a global level, the UN could not see any of this action making any difference whatsoever. Next, we will explore exactly why the Paris Agreement is not going to provide the salvation that was promised.